"Open your mouth wide," Mountain Man ordered. The slave girl, what he put inside, changed her forever. "Open your mouth wide," the man said. The words cut through the noise of the Deadwood Gulch auction yard, a place that smelled of dust, whiskey, and desperation. For a heartbeat, Temperance Tempe Washington thought the tall stranger was mocking her like the rest. Her wrists ached from the iron cuffs, her throat raw from holding back tears. Moments earlier, she'd been on the platform, listed as indentured for debt. The crowd jeered while the auctioneer barked, $200 for the big one, strong back, broad arms, she'll earn her keep in a mine or a field. Laughter rolled through the square. Tempe kept her eyes on the ground, praying for it to end. Then the stranger's voice rose steady, deep, impossible to ignore. 400. The crowd fell silent. He stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, a streak of gray in his beard, eyes the color of glacier water. Jeremiah Blackstone, former Army surgeon turned mountain prospector, laid the bills on the table. The auctioneer's hammer fell. When he reached her, he didn't yank the chain. He unlocked it. "You won't wear these again," he said quietly. His tone wasn't cruel, it was weary, resolute, as if he were fighting ghosts of his own. Tempe stared at him, unsure whether to fear or trust. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not as property, but as a person. "You'll ride with me," he said, "up the mountain. You'll work for fair pay. You'll sleep under a roof, not a whip." And when she hesitated, he added the same words she'd soon never forget. "Open your mouth wide. I'm a doctor, and I can tell from here that infection's already started. If I don't treat you, it'll kill you before the snow does." Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because this story of humiliation, mercy, and freedom, found in the most unlikely of places, begins right here at the edge of Deadwood Gulch. Temperance Washington had spent her entire life fighting for dignity in a world that never offered her any. Born to freed laborers who died in the fever outbreak of '73, she'd been taken in by her mother's half-brother, a man who saw her not as family, but as a way to pay off his gambling debts. When the collectors came, he signed her name to a contract she never saw, pledging 5 years of labor for the amount owed. On paper, it was legal. In truth, it was another kind of chain. By the time she stood on the platform in Deadwood Gulch, Tempe's hope had thinned to almost nothing. Her frame was large, solid from years of hard work in kitchens and washrooms. The crowd saw only that and smirked. The auctioneer called her a workhorse, and each insult landed like a stone. She bit her tongue until the blood filled her mouth, anything to keep from crying. When Jeremiah Blackstone placed his bid, the air itself seemed to shift. He didn't haggle, didn't leer, didn't even look at her the way men often did. He simply paid and told the clerk, "Draw up papers releasing her debt to me." Tempe waited for the cruelty she'd come to expect. Instead, he cut the iron from her wrists and gave her water. "Why?" she whispered. "Why spend that kind of money on me?" He shrugged, tightening the strap of his satchel. "Because you were about to die standing there." The wagon ride up Thunder Mountain was long and steep. Cold wind bit through her thin shawl. Snow gathered in the folds of her skirt. Blackstone drove in silence, the reins steady in his calloused hands. The only sounds were the creak of the wheels and the occasional cough that escaped her swollen throat. Halfway up the pass, she caught him watching her from the corner of his eye. "You're favoring your jaw," he said. "How long has it hurt?" Weeks, she admitted. Can't chew on the right side. Then you're infected, he said flatly. Open your mouth. Tempe turned away, mortified. It smells bad. He gave a short, humorless laugh. I've patched up soldiers dying of gangrene. I'll survive a bad tooth? Reluctantly she obeyed, and he leaned closer, examining her with the practiced detachment of a man who'd once held lives in his hands. Abscess, he muttered. If we don't treat it soon, it'll spread to the blood. She blinked back tears. You're a doctor? Was, he corrected, until I stopped believing anyone could be saved. They reached his cabin by nightfall, a sturdy structure of hewn pine perched above the timberline with smoke curling from its chimney. Inside was warmth, order, and something Tempe hadn't felt in years. Safety. He guided her to a chair by the fire, set a pot of water to boil, and said quietly, I can help you, but you'll have to trust me at least for tonight. For the first time since her parents died, she nodded without fear. Outside, the mountain howled. Inside, a woman who had been sold like cargo took the first fragile step toward being seen again. The climb up Thunder Mountain wasn't just a journey through snow and stone. It was a passage from one life into another. For the first 2 days, Temperance barely spoke. The world beyond the wagon's creaking wheels was a blur of white drifts and pine shadows. Each jolt of the road sent pain shooting through her jaw, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Jeremiah Blackston drove in silence, the brim of his hat pulled low against the cutting wind. He seemed carved from the same granite that crowned the mountain, yet for all his roughness, he never raised his voice. When she stumbled getting down from the wagon, he caught her by the elbow steady, not possessive. When she shivered too hard to hide it, he passed her his coat without a word. By the second night, they stopped beside a frozen creek. The sky burned with stars. The air glittered like glass. Jeremiah built a fire and set a pot to boil, the steam rising like ghostly hands into the dark. You should eat, he said, breaking a piece of bread and softening it in the broth. I can't chew, she murmured, pressing her palm to her jaw. He studied her for a moment, then took out a small vial from his pack. Whiskey and willow bark, he explained. Drink it. It'll dull the pain. Tempe hesitated. Why are you helping me truly? He stirred the fire with a stick, sparks dancing around his boots. Because once someone helped me when I didn't deserve it. I figure I owe the world a favor. She took the bottle, the burn of the whiskey warming her from the inside out. And now? He looked at her across the flames. Now I try not to let people die on my watch. They fell into quiet, then the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything unsaid. The fire crackled. Snow hissed softly against the coals. For the first time since the auction, Tempe's shoulders eased. When dawn came, she woke to find him already packing the wagon. He'd left a tin cup of coffee by her blanket, still hot. The gesture struck her harder than kindness ever had before. As the day wore on, the pain in her mouth worsened. By noon, tears blurred her vision. Jeremiah pulled the wagon to a stop. We're not waiting any longer, he said. If that infection reaches your blood, you won't make it another night. She shook her head, terrified. You can't do it here in the open. He was already unloading his bag, his movements brisk but gentle. I've done worse in the field. Sit. Tempe sank onto a fallen log. Trembling, he tore strips of clean cloth, poured whiskey over a knife, and met her eyes. Breathe through it, he said quietly, "when I tell you, open your mouth wide." The first touch of metal made her jolt, but his hand was steady against her shoulder. "You're safe," he murmured. "It'll hurt, but only for a moment." She tasted iron, salt, whiskey, and fear. But then came the sharp release of pressure, a warmth flooding out that wasn't pain, but relief. She gasped, and he caught her before she fell forward. "It's done," he said, voice low and reassuring. "You're going to be fine." By the time they reached the cabin that evening, the worst was over. Her fever had broken. He helped her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and set a bowl of broth before her. "Drink slowly," he said, "and Tempe." She looked up. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead before you're healed." But when she met his eyes, calm, certain, kind, she realized she already trusted him with more than her life. For the first time, she trusted someone with her hope. Outside, Thunder Mountain groaned under the weight of snow. Inside, two strangers sat before the fire, one fighting pain, the other his own ghosts, both unknowingly on the edge of something neither had dared to imagine. For the first few days in the cabin, Tempe slept more than she spoke. Fever came and went in waves. Sometimes she woke gasping, unsure of where she was, until she saw the fire glowing and Jeremiah's figure bent over his desk, mixing tinctures by lamplight. He moved with a quiet steadiness that calmed her, the same measured precision of a man who'd once saved lives in chaos. When her pain returned, he'd lift her head gently, place a warm compress against her jaw, and say, "Breathe, Miss Washington. You fought harder things than this." By the end of the week, she could eat broth and soft bread without trembling. Her voice came back low, rough, but alive. "You could have left me in Deadwood," she said one evening, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Saved yourself a fortune." Jeremiah didn't look up from the herbs he was grinding. "Deadwood's full of men who think a body's worth the price on a paper. I figured it was time someone remembered otherwise." She watched him a moment longer, the lamplight glinting off his spectacles. "Do you always talk like that?" He smiled faintly. "Only when someone makes me." Each day grew easier. Tempe insisted on helping around the cabin despite his protests. She swept the floors, washed the tin dishes, even fed the mule that brayed outside every morning. The air between them warmed, lightened, until laughter began to slip into their routine like sunlight through the cracks. Once, when she tried to carry a pail of water too heavy for her, Jeremiah reached over and took it from her hands. "You'll split your back in two," she laughed. "You think these shoulders are for decoration." He looked at her, then not at her size, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet admiration. "No," he said softly, "I think they've carried the world." That night, as she sat by the fire mending one of his shirts, Tempe felt something new, a peace that didn't come from rest, but from being seen. She'd been invisible for so long that the simple act of someone asking if she'd eaten felt like grace. When spring melted the last of the snow, Jeremiah began to teach her small things from his trade: how to grind willow bark into powder for fever, how to make poultices for burns, how to stitch a wound clean. Her hands were steady, her memory sharp. "You'd have made a fine nurse," he said one afternoon, showing her how to thread a needle. "I'd have made a fine many things if anyone had let me," she replied. He froze at that, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. "Then let's see what the mountain will let you be." As the weeks passed, Tempe's laughter grew louder, her steps surer. She no longer hid her smile behind her hand. The infection was gone, replaced by a glow that came from within. Jeremiah found himself watching her more often than he intended, the way she hummed while stirring stew, how she leaned against the doorframe at dusk to watch the sunset over the ridge. He tried to ignore the warmth creeping into his chest, but it was no use. One evening, as they shared supper, she asked quietly, "Why'd you leave medicine, really?" He hesitated. "Because I lost faith in saving anyone. My wife and son died in a fever camp. I treated strangers while they burned. By the time I came home, there was nothing left to save." Tempe set her spoon down. "So you came here to bury the doctor?" He nodded once. "And maybe myself?" She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "You failed the disease, not the people. But you saved me, Jeremiah. Doesn't that count for something?" His jaw tightened. "Maybe." "Then maybe it's time to stop dying and start living again," she said softly. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, the fire flickered, reflecting in their eyes. For a long moment, they just sat there, two survivors in a world that had already taken too much sharing. The quiet understanding that perhaps, at last, they'd found something worth staying alive for. By early summer, the mountain had turned green again. Wildflowers spilled down the slopes, and the cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and whatever Tempe was cooking. To anyone else, it might have looked like peace, but both she and Jeremiah knew peace on the frontier never lasted long. One afternoon, while Tempe was gathering herbs near the stream, the rumble of hooves broke the quiet. When she turned, 3 riders from Deadwood Gulch were making their way up the trail faces she remembered too well. The man in front, Deputy Collar, had been one of the loudest voices at her auction. The smirk he gave her now was the same one he'd worn that day. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Looks like the doctor's got himself a fine housemaid." Tempe's heart hammered. "You've got no business here." "On the contrary," Collar said, swinging down from his horse. "Town heard rumor Jeremiah Blackstone's keeping company with his indentured help. Sheriff sent us to see what's what." Jeremiah appeared in the doorway before she could answer. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp as a blade. "You can tell the sheriff he's wasting his time. The woman's free. I bought out her debt fair and legal." Collar spat into the dirt. "A paper don't change what she is." Jeremiah's jaw flexed. "It changes everything." The deputy's grin twisted. "Folks in town might think otherwise. Word gets around that you're living up here with a woman like her, well, people start asking questions." Jeremiah stepped off the porch, closing the distance until he stood an inch from Collar. "Then they can ask me to my face." The 2 men stared each other down until the deputy finally chuckled and turned to mount his horse. "Careful, Doc. You start mixing your blood with hers, and Deadwood'll come calling." He spat again, then rode off with his men, their laughter echoing down the trail. Tempest stood frozen, humiliation burning her throat. When Jeremiah turned back toward her, she flinched. "Don't you listen to them," he said quietly. "They'd rather see you in chains than see you healed." But that night, when the fire had burned low, Tempe spoke the truth weighing on her chest. "You don't understand, Jeremiah. Their words don't just bruise, they stick. They'll follow me forever. A woman like me doesn't get forgiven, not for being sold, not for being seen." He watched the flames for a long moment before answering. "Then we'll make our own forgiveness up here." But even he couldn't shut out the world completely. A week later, word spread through town that Blackstone was harboring a runaway servant. The sheriff sent a written summons for him to appear and clarify the matter. Jeremiah refused to go. "They can climb the mountain if they want my explanation," he said grimly. Tempe tried to reason with him. "You'll lose your license, your reputation." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Reputation? I buried that with my family." "But not me," she whispered. "You can't lose me to their hate." He turned then, eyes softening. "You think I care what they say about me? Let them talk. I won't let them drag you back down there." Still, she saw the strain in him, the sleepless nights, the way he stared toward the trail as if waiting for another intrusion. The mountain that had once been sanctuary was beginning to feel like a siege. One morning, while he was out cutting wood, Tempe packed a small satchel. She couldn't bear the thought of him losing everything because of her. When she stepped outside, the light was thin and gray, the valley below wrapped in fog. But before she reached the edge of the clearing, Jeremiah's voice stopped her. "If you leave now, they win." She turned slowly. He was standing there, axe resting against his shoulder, eyes raw with something between anger and pleading. "You think you're protecting me," he said quietly, "but you're the only thing keeping me alive." The fog swirled around them, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Tempe dropped the satchel, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then teach me how to fight, Jeremiah, because I'm tired of running." He stepped forward, pulled her into his arms, and whispered against her hair, "That's exactly what I've been waiting to hear." Outside, thunder rolled low over the mountain as if the world itself were warning them that the real battle had yet to come. The storm broke 3 days later. Thunder rolled down Thunder Mountain like cannon fire, shaking the pine trees to their roots. Jeremiah knew before he saw them that they were coming men from Deadwood, armed with torches and rifles, the kind of men who believed fire could burn away shame. Tempe was the first to spot them through the window. "They're here," she whispered, voice tight with fear. Jeremiah set his coffee down, eyes narrowing. "Get behind me. No matter what they say, you don't move." Rain poured as the riders reached the clearing. The sheriff led them, slick coat flapping, face pale with righteousness. Behind him, a dozen men miners, drifters, and townsfolk with nothing better to do than destroy what they didn't understand. "Blackstone!" the sheriff called over the storm. "We're here for the woman. You've no right keeping her. The debt contract was voided after the auction. She's government property now." Tempe flinched. Jeremiah stepped off the porch into the mud, unarmed except for the iron calm in his voice. "She's not property," he said. "She's under my protection. She's free." Lightning split the sky. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You think your word means more than the law?" Jeremiah's jaw tightened. The law that sold her wasn't worth the paper it was written on. A shot cracked the air warning, not aim, but it was enough to set every hand on a rifle. Jeremiah didn't flinch. "You'll have to shoot through me to reach her," he said. Tempe burst from the doorway, rain soaking her hair and dress. "Stop!" she cried. "You call yourselves men of God, yet you drag a woman back into chains? What kind of justice is that?" The sheriff's voice wavered. "You don't understand how the world works, girl." "I understand enough," she said. "I was born owing, lived working, and died 100 times under your kind of mercy. But this man, he saved me. Not because he had to, because he could." Her words hung in the storm like a bell tolling through the valley. For a moment, no one moved. Rain hissed against the rifles. Thunder growled. Then one of the older men at the back, an ex-soldier with a scarred cheek, lowered his gun. "Leave 'em be," he muttered. "She's right. We've all done enough wrong in this world." One by one, others followed. The sheriff stood alone, seething, before turning his horse with a curse. "You'll regret this, Blackstone," he spat, and rode back down the trail. When the last echo faded, Tempest sank to her knees in the mud. Jeremiah knelt beside her, his hands trembling for the first time. "You could have been killed," he said, voice breaking. "So could you," she whispered, "but you didn't let me face them alone." He lifted her chin gently. "Never again." Behind them, the cabin glowed through the rain, a beacon of defiance and something stronger than fear. On that mountain, they had won more than a fight. They had claimed their right to live, to heal, to love without permission. And for the first time in years, Jeremiah Blackstone looked at the storm and saw not ruin, but redemption. When the storm passed, the world felt strangely new. The clouds broke apart, and sunlight spilled over Thunder Mountain, washing the valley in gold. Smoke still curled from the cabin chimney, but inside the air was clear. No fear, no shame, just the quiet rhythm of two people who had finally earned their peace. Jeremiah sat at his work table, cleaning the same set of instruments that had once saved Tempe's life. She moved around the room with a gentle grace, folding linens, humming softly. Every sound she made seemed to steady him. "You're quiet," she said, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside him. He looked up, smiling faintly. "I was thinking about what comes next." "And what's that?" He set down the cloth and turned toward her. "Whatever you want it to be. You're free now, Tempe. No paper, no debt, no one to answer to." She studied him for a moment. "You talk like you're sending me away." He hesitated. "I promised you freedom. I won't take that from you." Tempe stepped closer until the light caught her face, no longer the woman who'd been auctioned, but one who had chosen her own name again. "Freedom isn't running," she said softly. "It's standing still where your soul can rest." Jeremiah's throat tightened. "And where does your soul rest?" She smiled, slow and certain. "Here, with you." He reached out, his rough fingers brushing hers. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a blessing. Inside, the cabin glowed warm against the dying sun. "You're safe here," he whispered. Tempe leaned her head against his shoulder, tears shining in her eyes. "I know, because for the first time in my life I chose it. Sometimes freedom doesn't come with broken chains or open gates. Sometimes it begins with one person daring to see another as human again." Jeremiah thought he was buying redemption for his own sins. Tempe thought she was being bought to serve. But in truth, they had both been rescued from shame, from loneliness, from a world too cruel to imagine mercy. He gave her healing. She gave him purpose. Together, they built something stronger than the past, something no law or hate could touch. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? If you still believe love can set people free, don't scroll away. The next story is waiting for you.